Alright, just closing out another session here from Lucky Chances. The scene might get a little bit repetitive, always walking out of the same property, but it's about 2:45 in the morning right now. Started the session like 8:30, something like that. So 6 hours of play. As per usual, gonna hop in the car, talk through the hands before heading home. All right, just like the previous session, quite a few hand recaps to get through. So I'm gonna blitz through some of these. In this first hand, there are limps from Under the Gun and the Hijack. The Hijack is a player that is pretty action heavy and playing pretty loose. And so when I look down at Ace Jack offsuit from the small blind, I raise it up to $35 and only the Hijack calls. Heads up to a flop of Ace 9-4 with 2 spades. So I flop top pair with a good kicker on a flush draw board. I c-bet it for $40 and he makes the call. Turn comes an Ace of Clubs, so I make trips. I decide to continue the aggression for $100 and he makes the call again. River comes the 7 of Spades, so not the best card because it brings in the front door flush. I decide to fire out $120, looking to still get some value against hands that contain a 9 in it. But when he decides to raise it to $345, to me it's pretty clear that he's got a flush and that he got there. There's really no other bluffs that he can have in his spot, I don't think, so I reluctantly let it go. This next hand involves the same player who limps from middle position. I raise it to $25 from the Hijack with Ace 10 of Clubs and only the middle position calls. We go heads up again to a flop of Jack 10-7 with 2 spades, so a very connected and dynamic board here. Can usually mix in checks on a board like this with second pair, but I do have backdoors and I'm up against a player that's pretty wide, so I think I can get called by worse. So I c-bet it for $25 and he makes the call. Turn comes a good card from my hand. It comes an Ace of Diamonds. He checks. I fire out another value bet, this time $75, and he makes the call. River comes a 5 of Hearts, so a great card because all of the draws brick out. He checks once more. I decide to fire out a bet of $200. He doesn't think too long and lets it go. So a common theme in these first set of hands is that I'm opening a lot, particularly when the action player is in the hand. And in this case, he's in the straddle this time. And I raise it to $35 from the Hijack with 4-5 of Clubs. I get calls from the cutoff, big blind, and the straddler. We go 4 ways to a flop of 10-9-8 with 2 clubs. Although I flop a flush draw, it's a very connected board in a 4-way pot. So when it checks to me, I think checking is the better play, so that's what I do, and the cutoff checks as well. 4 ways to a turn of a Deuce of Hearts. Big blind leads $80, straddler folds, and with just a small flush draw, it'll be very tough if I miss on the river, and if I hit, it could be dirty if the big blind has larger clubs. And I think it's just going to be really hard to get value if my hand would be good on the river. So all those things considered, I decide to take the conservative route and fold, and the cutoff folds as well. And when the big blind folds her hand, she does happen to flash what I believe is the 10 of Clubs. So I think I was in pretty bad shape in that hand. In this next hand, I open light from Under the Gun to $20 with 10 Jack off suit, and I get calls from the Hijack, button, small blind, and big blind. Heavily multi-way to a flop of Jack 10-6 rainbow, so flop top 2 pair on this board. When it checks to me, I c-bet $50, and only the Hijack makes the call. He's a pro that typically plays 5-10, and I've got a decent amount of history with him. He and I actually participated in some 5-10 games back in the day at the Pepper Mill when they used to run really good games there. And that was, I want to say, a good 5 to 7 years ago. And he was a good player then, and he's an even better player now. So I'm taking all of that in consideration as the hand progresses. The turn comes a Deuce of Diamonds, and that's a really good card to continue betting. So I fire out $125, and he makes the call. The river comes a King of Spades, so not the best card because it does complete some straights and some bigger 2-pair holdings. But I think he can also have King Queen in the spot, which would make a lot of sense. So in an effort to target a fairly narrow portion of his range, I fire out $225 for value. He thinks it through for a little bit and raises me to $500. It feels like a hand like Queen 9 of Diamonds or Ace Queen of Diamonds, which had a straight draw on the flop and then picked up backdoor diamonds on the turn. For that sizing, it feels like value rather than a bluff, and he's a good enough player to know that one pair is not good enough to raise for value here. So I just feel like I'm beat all day here. So After thinking it through for just a little bit, I decided to let it go. I did later ask if he was value bet bluffing me on the river, to which he answered that he had me. He said he thought I had ace king, and I told him I had better, so he seemed surprised that I folded, but based on our conversation, I'll just believe that I was beating that spot. In this next hand, there's an early position limp. Cutoff raises to $25. I'm on the button with pocket threes, and I make the call, and everyone else folds. We go heads up to a flop of ace 8-3 with 2 hearts, so I flop bottom set. He checks, I bet $25, and he makes the call. Turn comes a king of diamonds. He checks it again. I fire out $75, and he makes the call. River comes a 6 of clubs. He checks it once more, and I settle on a bet of $200, and he thinks it through for a little bit and makes the call. I table my hand, and it's good. In this next hand, there's a low jack limp. I raise it to $25 from the hijack with 10 jack offsuit again, giving this hand another try, and I get calls from the small blind and the low jack. We go 3 ways to a flop of queen 8-3 rainbow, so I flop the gutter ball. Checks to me, and I c-bet it for $30. Small blind raises to $110. We're playing over 1k deep here, so I decide to make the call with some implied odds. Turn brings a king of clubs, so I pick up open-ended. Small blind continues his aggression for $235. And if it were a different card, such as a offsuit deuce, I may consider putting in a bluff on this card. But because I pick up additional equity, I'm just going to go into realization mode and try to make my hand, especially since I've got another $800 back to play. So I just make the call. River comes an awesome 9 of diamonds, so I make the nuts. He's in the tank for quite a while and ultimately settles on a bet of $525. I've got $775 in my stack. I assemble it, I put it in. He ultimately goes in the tank for the additional $250 more. And after deliberating for a little bit, he lets it go. So I wasn't able to get full value, but nice to luckbox my way into a win on this hand. In this next hand, I raise it to $20 from under the gun with pocket sevens, and the big blind defends. Heads up to a flop of 7-6-5 with 2 clubs, so I flop top set on a very draw-heavy board. He checks it. I bet $25. He raises it to $80 with about $500 back. And I decide to put in a 3-bet on this flop to $225. He doesn't think too long, and he decides to make the fold. My range doesn't want to be putting in a 3-bet on this flop that often, but with a mix of a fairly shallow effective stack depth and such a draw-heavy board, that's the play I ended up deciding on. And unfortunately, it does not pay additional dividends because it looks like the big blind didn't have too much here. In this next hand, the low jack raises to $15. Hijack and cutoff call. I decide to make a relatively loose call from the button with 6-7 offsuit, and the big blind calls as well. We go 5 ways to a flop of 7-7 deuce with 2 diamonds. So I flop trips, checks to me, and I decide to check it back. The turn comes a jack of spades, checks to the low jack who bets $40. Hijack calls, and I decide to just make the call here. River brings a 5 of clubs, low jack checks, hijack bets $100. I decide to just make the call, and the low jack folds. Hijack shows king jack of hearts for a pair of jacks with a king kicker. I table my 6-7 and I take it down. In this next hand, there's a limp from the cutoff. I raise it to $25 with 8-10 of hearts from the button, and I get calls from the small blind, big blind, and cutoff. We go 4 ways to a flop of king jack 9 rainbow, so I flop a straight draw with backdoor hearts. Action checks through. Turn brings a 7 of clubs, so I make the straight. Small blind leads for $40, big blind folds, cutoff calls. I decide to raise it up to $140, and small blind calls, and the cutoff folds. River comes a 9 of hearts, and the big blind checks it. I settle on a bet of $200, and he pretty quickly lets it go. This next hand is pretty interesting, perhaps the most interesting hand of the night. Under the gun limps, middle position raises to $20, cutoff calls. I'm in a small blind with ace king of hearts. I 3-bet it to $105, and only the middle position calls, and we're playing pretty deep at over 1k effective. We go heads up to a flop of king 7-6 with 2 clubs, so nice to flop top pair in a 3-bet pot. I c-bet $75, and she makes the call. Turn comes a 5 of diamonds, so not the best card because it completes 8-9, which can be in her range, and it also brings in an additional flush draw. But I decide to continue firing, this time $200, and she makes the call. River comes a deuce of hearts, and now I'm not exactly sure if I can get 3 streets of value unless she has exactly king queen, so I decide to check it, and she fires out a bet of $425. I pick up what I believe is a little bit of a live tell, and this is typically a tell that would indicate someone having strength, and I do think it over for a little bit. And this isn't meant to be rude as I provide this analysis, but the typical stereotype amongst female poker players at 1-2 or 3-5 is that they're typically on the tighter end of the spectrum in terms of overall play. This player in particular has a lot of game, and she seems very capable to not just always have it. In an effort to provide a comparison, think of players such as Kristen Bicknell, Vanessa Selps, Kitty Kuo, players that are very aggressive and pretty studied. Obviously, it's not a true comparison because those players play high stakes, but just trying to provide a little bit of a player profile perspective on this particular opponent that I'm up against. And combo that with having a pretty strong hand here in a 3-bet pot, I decide to make the call. She tables ace-3 of clubs for the missed club draw. So her showing that hand reinforces that she does have a lot of game, and although it was an unsuccessful bluff attempt, I definitely got a lot of respect for that play. In this next hand, there's a middle position raise to $15. Hijack makes the call. I pick up ace deuce of clubs from the button, and it's a good spot to 3-bet, so I raise it to $65, and I get calls from the big blind, middle position, and hijack. Flop comes 8-4-4 with 2 clubs, and when it checks to me, it's a good flop for my specific hand because I have the nut flush draw, and I've got the overpair range advantage. So I c-bet it for $70, and everyone folds. Last interesting hand to note of the session, it's a straddle pot. There's a raise from the hijack to $30. Cutoff calls. I'm in the small blind with queen jack of hearts, and I decide to 3-bet it to $140, and only the cutoff makes the call. We go heads up to a flop of 10-9 deuce rainbow, so I flop open-ended with some overs. I decide to c-bet it for $100, and he makes the call. Turn comes a 7 of hearts, so I pick up additional equity. He's only got $260 left, and I decide to put it all in there, and he decides to snap me off. The river comes a deuce of diamonds, so I miss despite having all that equity. And before I can show my hand, he tables ace deuce off suit for the river trips. I'm glad I wasn't ahead in that hand because that would have been a pretty painful suck out. But clearly he was willing to gamble and he had some type of read where he believed that a pair of deuces was good. It holds for him, and he takes his hand down. All right, that wraps it up for all of the notable hands played tonight. It was a bit of a turbulent start to the session and a lot of ups and downs, really. And I was ultimately in the game for $1,500. Started off with $900, so I had to add on $600, and ultimately cashed out $3,221. So a profit of $1,720 over 6.5 hours of play. But yeah, I found myself in quite a few interesting and difficult spots tonight, some of which were self-induced, but was luckily able to navigate it and ultimately book a nice win. And that's going to wrap it up for this one. I'll catch you all on the next one.